very pleased to be in, well, what is essentially a school hall in Penard. I'm joined by Jeff Towns.
Pleased to be here.
Very, very pleased to have you here. As I walked here this morning in the pouring rain, so it's a lovely August day, I listened to some of Vernon's poetry. So he was reading his poetry, and I thought it was...
Was it him reading?
It was him reading.
Right. Is that off that LP that came out, or is it... There's an LP of poems by him?
They are off an LP,
yeah,
so it's part of the BBC Radio 3 programme.
Yeah. It's interesting that he did bring out a spoken word thing. And is his voice unbelievably posh?
Yes, so like R.S. Thomas, I find who...
I think Vernon's... Iris has got that... There's a Welshness in Iris that's not in Vernon. And one of the things I think that was interesting was I never met Vernon. I got to Swansea a few years after he died. But I met Gwen, and I've known her ever since. I've known Gwen for 40 years, maybe more, 50. And I've heard so much about Vernon from her, and I handled manuscripts that he wrote when he was having his breakdown that were in the National Library. It's as if I know Vernon. But the first time I talked about that interview that Colin Edwards made with Vernon, his voice on that, because he's being recorded by a TV man, it's almost laughable, I think. I mean, it's not his fault. He got sent to Repton. Yeah. He was from a good family. So I never met Vernon, but what I didn't realise when I got to Swansea and started doing what I was doing with the bookshop was that Vernon died quite young. Was he 60 odd?
61.
Yeah, 61, playing tennis. So he had too much drink, he had too much tennis, because Gwen apparently phoned him and said, "You've played for long enough, come home."
That's right.
And anyway, Dylan's other friends all lived to good ages. So I ended up getting to know Fred James really well, Mervyn Levy really well, Daniel Jones I knew but not that well, Winfred Vaughan Thomas. So there was hardly one of that so-called ridiculous Cardona gang slogan.
Visionaries.
They were interesting. Everyone worthy of mention, but they weren't a club. They weren't a team. They would hate to think that they were being looked at as a little coterie and that their leader was Dylan Thomas, because they were all independently very, very talented. But they all, now I thought about it, they all spoke with very, very posh accents or non-Welsh accents. Now, Dylan's father sent him to elocution classes to get rid of his Welshness. The others, Fred had a lovely speaking voice. Winfred Vaughan Thomas, professional Welshman, but his English was impeccable. Mervyn Levy, cut glass again, once you've got him going, but they all had this, and Vernon set the bar high, except that the truth of the matter is that he was a very late joiner of those sessions. He went once a week to the Cardona, and he, regularly on a certain day. The others, Charlie Fisher, see, I knew Charlie Fisher, incredible voice. He lived in Canada, and I drove up into Canada and went and visited with him for a few days, and then twice he came and stayed with me in Swansea. Charlie's voice was incredible.
So why is that? That's a class thing.
I think at that point they were all middle class kids. Their parents all were in. Dylan's father was a headmaster. Fred James's folks had green grocery business, and Dan Jones' father was a musician. They were middle class kids. They were well educated, and I think at that point, the fact that both Dylan's parents spoke Welsh and all his family, relatives, were Welsh speaking. His dad didn't want him to speak Welsh. His dad was quite a proud Welshman.
This is parental aspiration.
It was the fact that at that point, Welsh was considered the language of the proletariat, and that to get on in the world, you had to speak English. And they all, that little group and the rest of the boys probably in his school were pretty much like that.
I mean, so you had Dylan and Vernon obviously had that Uplands connection.
Yeah.
Which was a very up-and-coming area, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So, but Vernon himself, originally, he came from Maesteg.
Yeah.
So
doesn't have much Welsh though, does it? I think he had more than Dylan.
No.
But, I don't think Welsh was ever used, as far as I know, in their house. His dad was a bank manager, wasn't he? And,
yes.
But no, it is, I think, that voice of Vernon's, it can be a little daunting. You have to kind of listen for a while and then forget.
It is surprising.
Well.
And that received pronunciation,
I know.
It's deliberate.
And that's, it's just, he probably didn't speak too much in the bank, but they must have thought, goodness, who are you?
So he was working all day, wasn't he, in Lloyd's in the bank?
By the Sandfields, that big building on the corner there.
Beautiful building, which is now
a gaming place.
A gaming place.
Not,
still quite grand.
It's great.
Big doors.
When it was up for sale, I think I was looking for somewhere to move from Salubrious Passage because Wine Street had gone so boozy and I couldn't do any business there in the day. There was nobody there. And I actually went and looked at that building and it was for sale by tender and I really wanted to buy it. It was massive. And I thought, God, this would be a great place to fill with books. And I could have a plaque on it then saying, to have Dylan's bookstore in the bank at Vernon. But I think a betting company, I tendered a very low tender, but I think they just decided they wanted a big betting office there, which is what it became. And then they went, whatever reason they went, and it's become a cafe where you can go and play ball games.
Apparently he used to open the door on his knees.
Right. Well, there's stories that he left one night without locking it. Because he was away with the fairies, like the poetic fairies is what he was away with.
And Philip Larkin that said there was something really technically meticulously like did he liken it to a hard stone?
Right.
I forget now. But there was something meticulous and hard and brilliant about his poetry.
I mean, his friendship with Larkin was intense. And if you read Larkin's first book of poems, The North Ship, at the start he acknowledges that going to see Vernon give a reading in Bletchley is what made him want to become a poet again. He'd written poetry, didn't think it was any good. Then he went and he spoke to Vernon. I think Vernon encouraged him.
He was known for that, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Very encouraging.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, I think him and Dylan had a rule that no matter how bad the poetry was that was shown them, you always tried to say something positive. Which is a wonderful thing to do. Hard sometimes because, when I had my bookshop, people would come in with their books of poems or poems they wanted to have made into a book. And
of course.
Everyone's entitled to, they say that everybody's got a book inside and every single person, a lot of them should stay there. I've had too much experience with self-published, but everyone's entitled to do it.
Yeah, so we're sitting in Panard Hall now, and very close by is a beautiful limestone memorial to Vernon, unveiled by Gwen Watkins, more on Vernon's wife, Gwen Watkins later, and it's inscribed with a lovely line of his poetry. Now, when we were putting that stone there, 2 people got in touch because they saw some press around it, and they got in touch to tell me that he was very generous and had taught them in some capacity, gave them, always read, meticulously edited the poetry that they sent him. And then I often come across that he was called one of the best friends, most humble, honest. It seems to be a character trait, doesn't it?
I mentioned this book to you, Dylan Thomas Letters to Vernon Watkins, and the amount of detail in this book, Vernon's notes between every letter, he says, Dylan sent me this poem, Dylan sent me this poem. They argue about a word. I think Vernon was the only one for Dylan's early first 2 books who he used as a sounding board and would listen to. And he would gently give Vernon, but the other thing that Dylan did was bully Vernon into publishing some of his poetry. And it's remarkable that Vernon wasn't being published, and then when Dylan got involved with Kajik Rees, who started that magazine called Wales, and there were 11 issues before the war, and every issue is fantastic, and Dylan got Vernon, bullied him into sending poems to Kajik Rees, the editor, and the first time that Vernon's poems he sent to Dylan, Dylan changed some words, and they were published in Wales magazine, and Vernon looked at it, was absolutely enraged. More enraged, I think, than when Dylan didn't turn up at his wedding. The fact that Dylan had the temerity to change it, and Gwen told me that he would go into every Swansea bookshop that stocked Wales magazines in his lunch hour and rewrite the actual words on the top. And not long after telling me that, I found an issue, which I've still got, with Vernon's corrections on it. And she was over the moon, because she knew he did it, but she'd never seen one. And I keep losing it, because I've got a number of copies of that, and which one has got it? And I might even have sold it with his corrections in, but that annoyed him, Dylan doing that. So there is that, the friendship was deep. It was deep as friends, it was deep poetically, but I think it sort of petered out when Dylan went to London, and the letters get fewer, and he's too busy, and then he dies at 39. And for Vernon, and for Kerry Richards actually, that was a huge turning point in their lives. They were the two. Dylan only met Kerry Richards once, just
Kerry
before.
Richards was their friend, artist.
A big friend of Vernon's. I think Fred James drove Dylan and Vernon to see Kerry, and Kerry was absolutely deeply impressed by Dylan. Vernon had obviously bigged him up, and so when Dylan was dying in New York and letters were coming back to Dan Jones, and phone calls and telegrams, and Vernon was involved and Dan Jones was involved, Kerry Richards heard this, and he just began to do drawings in books of Dylan's poems, and on every page, and then eventually made a big suite of lithographs. But he also did the same for Vernon. Vernon, I think Vernon let him stay, and or either Vernon went to stay with Kerry to recuperate, or Kerry stayed with Vernon, and there was a big limited edition of a Vernon Watkins book done in Italy with lots of white paper around the edges.
He did some inscriptions.
That's it. He then did drawings all around the edge of that. So, there was a real collaboration between Kerry and Vernon, and Kerry and Dylan and Vernon. They were close. And even the other great Swansea artistic couple, Ron Core and Glenys Core, when Dylan died and there wasn't much going on in Swansea in terms of a memorial, Gwen, Vernon and Ron Core and Glenys, his artist, the four of them went to Cymru Cairo Quarry, and they picked this stone and brought it back, had it brought back to Swansea, a huge lump of granite, and then Ron Kerr engraved, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, but on the stone. And it's something that people don't know. There's photos of it being unveiled, which I have with Ron and Vernon and the council around. I had it once. They got a telegram from the two women in New York who founded Kaidman Records, two young girls in New York, Barbara, I can't remember. Anyway, I know that. These two girls saw Dylan read, they were in publishing, they went to their publishers and said, we've got to record this man. And the publisher, young whippersnappers, what do you want to. So they pooled their money and they found a company and they record Dylan. And straight away, the first thing they record is Dylan reading 5 poems. And then they thought, well, we've got another side of the LP, but we've got nothing for him to read. And he hadn't brought anything with him. They ran out, they bought a copy of a magazine that had just come out. They had a Child's Christmas in Wales in. And they bought a copy of it, ran back to the recording place. Dylan read. When the record came out, it just said 5 poems by Dylan Thomas. By the time the second printing came out, it was called A Child's Christmas in Wales and Poems. And that recording has sold millions and millions. And by the time they, in 53, when that monument was being made, they made a lot of money.
So
and
this
they
granite,
paid. They sent a text saying,
yeah.
heard about the memorial, we'll cover all costs.
It's interesting that Dylan's memorial is made of granite and Vernon's is made of limestone.
Yeah. Yeah, I never thought of that.
Yeah. I've just suddenly struck me because we went to it's just you describing the quarry and we went to quite great lengths with Ian, a wonderful sculptor who sculpted it around me, to find a piece of limestone represented, because Vernon always said, I'm not a nature poet. You know, he said that himself, didn't he? But he's a metaphysical poet, a lyrical poet, but obviously so many of his poems, what got me, or led myself and many people in the local and wider area into his poetry, is his intimate knowledge of the landscape. Yeah. And you mentioned Carrie, and I think one of the most poignant things I've ever read is when Carrie describes the landscape without Vernon's wiry, sure-footed, you know, his foot knew every crevice of this.
I mean, he's always been.
Gower,
you know, it's hard for any writers in Swansea after Dylan Thomas, because he got that. You know, he died very publicly, slowly. It took him a week to die. It was covered in New York papers and London papers, and then all the furore around him that's, you know, still goes on in some ways. It was hard for another poet, so in a way, Vernon, I mean, what's interesting is that, although I didn't find that, I always thought it was interesting that Dylan was published by J.M. Dent, who weren't massive poetry publishers, but were a very serious publisher. Yeah. So after his first book came out with the Sunday Referee and Partners Street Bookshop, the second book is J.M. Dent, and he stayed with Dent all his life then. And Vernon was published by Faber, and that's T.S. Eliot. And I always thought, wow, that's amazing that Eliot published Vernon.
It is.
And Dylan went to see T.S. Eliot when he first got to London, writes about meeting him, and he met him a couple of times. Vernon, he talked about T.S. Eliot. And T.S. Eliot, he showed him poems. T.S. Eliot didn't take him on, but gave him money. You know, he was in London and didn't have much money. Eliot had money and was generous with money to Dylan in their first few meetings. But I then read that just before 18 Poems was going to the printers, but it was already there, that far advanced, he phoned Dylan and said, yes, I will publish your poetry. And Dylan said, you're too late, it's coming out by the Sunday Referee. And so they could have both been Faber publishers, which would have been interesting because Faber books looked the part. And I tell you what else is interesting, that after Dylan, he'd refused Dylan, he then published Vernon, T.S. Eliot, and Idris Davis, who was a totally different poet to Vernon, like a mining poet who wrote sort of poems inspired by history, you know, the great strikes and all that. And so I think he thought, well, I missed out on Dylan Thomas, so I'm not going to lose any other Welsh poets. And so I think that's interesting. And the Faber books are very elegant, you know, they are.
They are.
Through the war, there was a paper shortage, so some of the regular editions come out on beautiful handmade paper, decal-edged, and so and I think for Vernon to have Faber's gave him a kudos.
Absolutely.
I don't think the book sold incredibly well, and I think for a long while he was kind of, there were the movement poets came along, and then things changed again. That he was always just too dense, I think, for a lot of people. But as I said before, I think a good anthology of selected poems gets you into his poetry.
It does, and we discussed, didn't we, you know, for example, you're talking about mining, and I instantly think, oh, Vernon wrote The Collier.
Yeah, sure.
You know, so, and we were discussing the fact that he will, or you've got The Dead Shag. So you have these really accessible poems that are about the experience.
Yes.
I mean, obviously he's really believes in the muse and that voice coming out, very feminine, like the Greek and Roman.
Well, that whole business of him going to Dublin to see Yeats.
Yeah.
So he takes with him a Frenchman called...
Is this before he meets Dylan?
No, but a long while afterwards.
A long while afterwards.
So the guy...
When's he meet Dylan? 35?
Yeah, 34 he met,
34,
because he thought he was the only poet in Swansea. So he leaves work one day and he goes to the local bookshop and there's all these copies. Local poet, 18 poems, 3 and 6. And he's appalled. How come there's a poet being published who I don't know? And every lunchtime he goes for a week, this is what Gwen told me, and he reads another poem and he can't resist going back. And at the end of the week, he buys the book.
Gwen told me that. He took a week.
Yeah. Just trying to think, is this as good as I think it is? And being blown away. So I think he knew somehow that Dylan was related, Dylan's aunt Dozie was married to the vicar of Paraclete Chapel. The Reverend Bill Rees, the chapel in Newton, where I live, in the manse to that church, where Dylan stayed on weekends. But he went to see that vicar and said, I want to meet Dylan Thomas. And he gave Vernon his address, and I think Vernon wrote. They didn't work phones in those days, and they met very shortly after that. And the Reverend Rees told Vernon that Dylan Thomas should be in the madhouse. Dylan told Vernon that he loathed the Reverend Rees from his Dantruff to his corns. You can't loathe anybody more than that.
No,
from the utter top to the utter bottom. Gwen told me that and was very proud of that description. And Dylan then wrote a poem in his notebook called The Reverend Crap, about a vicar who takes lads up behind the font and gets up to no good. And in his notebook, he actually crosses out the Reverend Crap and puts the Reverend Rees.
Okay.
And Vernon was party to all of that.
Yeah.
And I think it's amazing, given the difference between their personalities, that they could have such a strong friendship and could go out and drink together. But Gwen writes about the first time she met Dylan Thomas in the Café Royal.
Yeah, so Vernon and Gwen, so Gwen Watkins is Vernon's wife.
Sure.
And they met at Bletchley Park.
Yeah, where Dan Jones was well.
Yeah. Yes.
So, Swansea was well represented, wasn't it?
It was.
And Gwen wouldn't have met Vernon unless she was there. No. To me, Gwen's every bit as important as Vernon.
She is.
She's a remarkable woman.
She's
so much.
Incredible.
Still alive. We're talking about her now.
And not far away.
Not far
she's
away.
Not far from us. In Heatherslade.
No, she's amazing. And I think, that little this Wilfred Owen book I brought here, in the front it says Vernon. This is from his sister. But I've got books inscribed to Vernon from Gwen. And books were important to them, and Gwen would buy books. This says Vernon with love from Dot. Christmas 1963. That's his sister Dot, who was a remarkable woman herself, and she's given him the collected poems of Wilfred Owen, with an introduction by C. Day Lewis, and a memoir by him. So they were steeped in poetry.
He's famous. He's famously known for trying to prevent the Italian transcriptions being burnt. In Germany, when he passed, I'm recalling, and they were burning books. Burning books in front of him, and he tried to intervene and save the books. I mean, this is I suppose in his obituary he's described as a shy man. But to do something as brave, which I think shows the importance.
The other thing that you have to mention as well is that Dylan Thomas was monoglot. English, you'd say, English, BBC Third, and barroom. He could speak. That's the two languages. Vernon had German,
Yes.
French, some Spanish. So all of, Dylan called himself the Rumbo of Condonkin Drive. It was Vernon who told him all about Rambo, and it was Vernon who told him about these other poets who Dylan couldn't read, so Vernon would show him good translations of them, and maybe even talk about the translations. So Dylan's knowledge of European poetry all comes from Vernon.
And the lyrical, there's a beautiful elegy for Vernon Watkins by Roberto Sanesi. Sanesi. So it's been translated, Henry Martin, and and the way that he can capture, he says, you would have said that the hills of Wales were green and purple in the dry wind of the ferns and the sea, bluebells and horses, on the backs of the clouds, herons and gulls, plummeting through the air like petals of white flowers, and you would have surrendered yourself to the repeated, subdued and dazzling sound of the sky, like a mirror of the curving moon. The fact that, I think for me, when I read that, I thought, this is so beautiful. And
Sanesi was
and then I just wondered, and he mentions Gower. He would say there is no contradiction in the great purple night that explodes in the sunset on the hills of Gower with the cold wings of the swan that accompanies its path. This is an elegy for Vernon Watkins. If somebody wrote an elegy for me, you have carried back the sense of your vision.
I see you while you play at tennis with Taliesin.
Yeah.
My grandson's called Taliesin.
Yeah.
Never seen that line before. Sanesi did a lot with Dylan Thomas. He did the Italian editions of Dylan Thomas. But then he came to Swansea and met Vernon.
Did he?
And there are two.
So he did come to Swansea. That was going to be my question.
Oh no, he definitely came to Swansea. Okay. And he did two, Sanesi did two huge boxes. One of them with poems in by Vernon and two lithographs by Kerry. And another one called Journey to the North, which is poems by Vernon and 9 lithographs by Kerry. And they're huge big boxes. Kerry took every bit as much trouble with them as he did with the suite of illustrations for Dylan Thomas's poems.
Okay.
So Sanesi was a mover and a shaker in Italy. He did a very fancy edition of Dylan Thomas's play that was in the school magazine called Lunch at Mussolini's, and Fred James's sister had the manuscript, and Sanesi took it to Italy and it never came back. But he did publish it.
Okay.
And Ralph Wissart, the bookseller, Ralph the Books in Swansea, who was, I called my bookshop Dylan's, but really Ralph's was Dylan's bookstore. That's where he went. Ralph knew Dylan. Interestingly, at the moment, a bookseller in California who I know has got a copy of Dylan's first book, 18 Poems, only 250 copies of it, and it's inscribed to Ralph the Books again, from Dylan Thomas again, and it's £13,000 plus. And I'd like it, but I can't afford 13 grand for a book with that inscription like that. But it's, Sanesi went in to see Ralph, and Ralph had a letter from Dylan saying, I'm sorry I haven't paid you for that cheque that bounced, but I'll sort it out as soon as I can. And Ralph had kept the cheque, don't know what happened to that, but he gave the letter to Sanesi. He said, can I borrow it to try it? Never got the letter back. So Ralph gave me a photocopy of the letter that he happened to have, but Sanesi kept the original. And interestingly, after Sanesi died, his widow came to Swansea and came to the Dylan Thomas Centre and wanted to donate some of Sanesi's material to, in fact there was a memorial event for Sanesi because he'd done so much in Swansea, in the Glenvivian.
Wow, I'm glad I asked.
And I went to that,
yeah.
And they made a nice brochure for it as well, which Gwen contributed to. And when his widow came back, because she knew that the people of Swansea had taken her husband in, and said she would donate stuff, I was wondering, and I wanted to ask her, you haven't actually seen a manuscript of Lunch at Mussolini's or the letter that Ralph Wissart, but she did send some stuff, but it was pretty ordinary stuff.
When I think of Vernon, and before you even start to talk about him and his poetry, when you think of the people that he influenced or had an impact on, and actually just people who physically came here to see Vernon. And you know, I wander around the cliffs and I think, wow, Philip Larkin walked along here, R.S. Thomas walked along here. They were talking about poetry.
Gwen told me categorically, and I'll never forget it when she told me, that she was at the sink in the Garth, like in her rollers almost, and in her house coat, and she looks and she sees an incredibly handsome man coming along with Vernon, and it was, now, come on Jeff, the South American man, Neruda, Pablo Neruda, who was got the Nobel Prize. And he came in and he came into the house and they talked and chatted.
Is this when they had no toilet as
and
well?
something like that. And when he left, he gave her a kiss on both cheeks, and she said she felt like a schoolgirl and she wouldn't wash, you know. But I've been through everything about Neruda, and I put into the internet Vernon Watkins, Neruda, Gower.
Nothing.
There's no record. But when someone like Gwen tells you a story like that, you know it's true. But it just didn't get anyone else. I don't think how he got to Swansea Neruda, what he was doing. But you know, when you say the number, when they went to America, she met Marion Moore and all those, you know, all the poets that were around then. Vernon got to know, and they looked after him. So.
And of course, Gwen is a writer in her own right.
Well, I think the book that she wrote, in this country it's called Portrait of a Friend. She was annoyed when in America they changed it to Portrait of a Friendship, because she wanted it to be her take on Dylan and Vernon, but not just their friendship. Vernon in his own right and Dylan in his own right, and the ups and downs of their relationship.
Yeah.
Whereas the American one, Portrait of a Friendship, makes it sort of more about the both. But the American publishers decided to do it. I went to the launch of that book in the Glenvivian, and it's a lovely book, and Paul Ferris said it's actually the best book about Dylan Thomas, in as much as it's got more honest opinions, because Gwen has got her own opinions. She's a critic, you know, she's a very well-read woman.
Yeah.
So the book, she's close to Vernon, and she gets Dylan Thomas completely, you know, in the times that she spent with her.
Yeah.
And so it was published in the Glenvivian Gallery by Goma Press, who were a Welsh press from down Llandyssil, and they were in, and there was wine being given out, and it looked to me like they weren't too comfortable with the fact that there was wine. And I said to one of the partners, I said, "Hey, have you got an American edition?" "America?" He said, as if, "Oh, books don't go to America." It did come out in America by a university press. So that's a really good book. But I mean, she wrote on Dickens, didn't she? She wrote on that.
Sylvia. I read one about the relationship between, was it madness and genius?
Oh, that's
creativity.
Yeah.
I forget the name of it.
Yeah.
What
Madness.
So
Madness. Yeah, and she told me that her and Ruth did that book together, although a lot of it was Gwen, but Ruth was a bright woman.
They live close to each other, don't they? Do they live near each other? Or, oh no, I'm thinking of Gladys Cole.
No. The interesting thing about Ruth Pryor is that she was teaching at the university where Vernon was going to, and she was English, very posh, fantastically, she could do, where you can look at ancient manuscripts and read them, and she also had worked at the Folger Shakespeare Library, so she was a huge scholar. And she's at this university, Gwen and Vernon come, Vernon dies, the university are kind of in shock because he was about to start giving his lectures and a lot of students had signed up. What are we going to do? Gwen said, "I'll give the lectures," because she knew what Vernon was going to say. Vernon had probably done lecture notes for them all. So she ends up delivering the notes, and then when she comes back to England, Ruth comes with her, and they become a couple. But I've known friends. I know, you know, I'm not, and so they live on the Gower together, and Ruth gets this second house built that they go and live in. Then they move to Oxford because Gwen's got contacts there, and Ruth has well, and they live in a house in South Moor, where I used to visit them quite regularly and stay with them. And interestingly, Gwen didn't drink, Ruth would make sloe gin, phenomenal sloe gin. And when I would go in the evening, she'd say, "Shall we have a little drink?" And she would be, and Gwen, she'd get a little bit tipsy, and Gwen was a little bit, didn't approve, but not in a different way. But they were a very interesting couple. They started a book business.
Wow.
They became booksellers, and they decided that they would only deal in books by women writers. And the more obscure the women writers were, the better it was. And they called themselves Arena Books. And if you look up Arena, she's a goddess. Or so. I used to know, but yeah, they were booksellers. So when they did that book on Genius and Madness, they had a psychologist working with them as well, who was acknowledged, and he put the sort of medical stuff in. And so he went to see them in Oxford, and there was an Oxford book fair going on. And Gwen and Ruth went to look around, see if they could find books that they could buy. And it was a big fair, the Oxford Fair. The one they went to, I wasn't exhibiting at, but I did exhibit. It was in the Randolph Hotel. And they went all around the book fair with this psychologist. When they came out, Gwen told me this. He said, "Well, I don't know about writers, but all booksellers are insane." Because, when you've got a big room full of booksellers, they're all different.
Yes.
They come from different walks of life.
This was
They're all kind of crazy, because to actually think you can make a living selling used books is a bizarre thing to do. But a lot of people used to. You can't do it as well now because of the internet and all that nonsense. But he thought that the booksellers were mad.
Didn't Gwen's father find Vernon quite eccentric? He said something like, "Well, he's full of God."
And also, Vernon had a serious breakdown in his 20s. He was living in a house in Cardiff, terrace, and there was a road accident outside his house, and someone picked up, I can't remember now whether the body was dead or whether it was very damaged, and walked up the little path in where Vernon was in a flat, and he looked out the window and saw this chap coming with it, and he had a massive breakdown. And Gwen writes about it, and other people write. Apparently, he went back to his old school, where Fisher was headmaster, who then became Archbishop of Canterbury. And Vernon had an axe with him. He was in a terrible mental. He was having a breakdown. But his parents took care of him, put him in a place to get him healthy again, found him a job as a bank clerk, which was the best thing they could do, and the rest of his life he was writing poetry and thinking about it.
Is that right, that he destroyed the poetry to that point?
That's right.
His previous writing. But he also saw that as an enlightening period as well, in a reflection, in his reflection.
The interesting thing that I think of now is that Rowan Williams, the Archbishop, is a huge fan. I wrote to him first, I will say, but he wrote a wonderful letter back and said if I could come to the opening of the stone, I would. Yeah, I know. I don't know if I've got it. He wrote a letter to Gwen at one point, I think, when she'd edited a book, and he might have written, we did a book together, he wrote the introduction.
Yeah, and he did the introduction to this one, which is very accessible.
Yeah.
Vernon Watkins' new selected poems.
That's by Richard, isn't it?
With Richard Rams.
Who did the biography.
Yes, he's written a biography.
I know him well.
Exact mysteries.
Yeah.
So
Rowan wrote to Gwen and said, of course I like his poetry, but the fact that he didn't get on with Fisher is very good with me. He did think Fisher was a great archbishop. So in his letter, he actually says, anyone who doesn't like Fisher is a man for me or something.
Excellent.
I met Rowan a couple of times, and he always used to talk about Vernon and then RS.
He reads the Ballads of Marlowe.
No, he's amazing.
The canter, the rhythm, because we said before, for all the affectations of his voice, there's no denying the Welsh in the poetry.
Oh, sure, no. There's Welsh names all the way through it. He writes about Marie-Claude, doesn't
Yeah.
it? His first
Yes.
book is called.
Yes.
You know, the first book that ever
Yes.
comes out is the Ballad of the Marie-Claude.
And the idea of the threshold
Yeah.
and the opening, because there's one poem, isn't there, that Gwen explains,
Yeah.
came to him in one,
Sure.
Griefs
Sure.
of the Sea.
Well, yeah, I got sidetracked when Francis de la Fère-Lebras, a Frenchman, came to Swansea as the language assistant in Swansea Grammar School, and he became friends with Vernon. And Dylan had gone to London then, but this guy Francis was well into literature and poetry. They became close friends. When Vernon went to Dublin to meet and sit with Yeats just before Yeats died, Francis went with him. And on the train coming back, Vernon writes everything that happened that becomes the poem, Yeats in Dublin. You know, he remembered every word, and he spoke it to Francis, who took notes, I think, and then Vernon made it, and it's just an account, a poetic account of what it meant for him, because for him, Yeats was the greatest. I think for Dylan Thomas, they both liked Blake, and Dylan was more in the path of Blake. But Yeats, I think, for Vernon, had everything that Vernon wanted in poetry in terms of, you know, Yeats was involved with the Golden Dawn and mysticism and that, which was what Vernon saw. So the fact that they got together there. The other interesting fact is that when Dylan's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog came out in 1949, Francis translated it into French, and it came out in French when Dylan was still alive. So Francis and like Vernon and Francis, there's all these little, you know, like the fact that Kerry's involved and Dan Jones is involved, and they all like stayed together as a group, I think, of friends. But like I say, like, the Cardoma Boys is a journalistic trope. They didn't belong to a club, and they didn't meet regularly.
You have the Cardoma gang, and it's you're right actually, because when you actually look at it, the times when they are actually all together,
very few.
Very few.
And Dan hardly ever went.
You're right.
You know, so in that group, Dan is the polymath.
Yeah.
Fred James is no slouch academically.
No, and of course he
painted that wonderful picture of Vernon.
Amazing
that makes him look
painting.
like he's from Venus.
I know.
But the drawing, which
is
I think one of the boys has got, or that she's got a copy, I think the boys have got the original, which they've lent. The drawing is sensational. And Fred always said that the cartoons for his work, like the drafts, are where all the virtue is. The painting is like done by, so like he rules the lines. The Dylan Thomas portrait and the Vernon one, he uses a ruler almost to get those patterns and lines in it.
He has that with a lot of his paintings, and those dual colours.
Sure.
They're something
Have
in
you
themselves.
ever seen the painting that's in St Mary's Church in town?
St Mary's Church in town, no.
There was a vicar at St Mary's Church who decided he would buy local art and hang it in the church. And he bought a huge Kerry Richards, which is hung in there.
Huh?
And then he asked Fred for a painting. And Fred did a painting that's in there. And it's a mother and child, but it's Gwen, one of her children. And I've got the cartoon for it. And it is sensational. It looks like Henry Moore. It's all swirling blankets, and there's a little face of the baby there, and Gwen looking down at it.
Because of course he had 5 children, didn't he? And that we talk about his poetry, but his family life, and obviously we discussed earlier the humorous poems that he wrote for his children.
Yeah.
I got this real picture of him as I was coming over and listening to him read his poetry, of him, because he didn't drive, getting off the bus on a rainy day, going home, instantly taking off his
wet raincoat, and his
hat, of course, big grey hair, a lot of it, didn't he? Rangy figure, and then put him on his home clothes, and then he would go for a walk, or I think Gwen said in that interview he would put some Mozart on or something, then out for a walk, even if it was just to the headland. And every time I look over Hunts Bay, I think of Vernon. Every time. And of course, you've got that little
stone there,
hidden
yeah.
stone there.
It's interesting,
At
at one
the
point,
stones, what a line. The tongue of the wave.
there were more monuments to Vernon in Swansea than there was to Dylan Thomas.
Yeah.
And there's more now, I think, in
Yeah.
a way, but they're coming more. But yeah, because he did get identified as the poet of Gower. That's how people who wanted to make him different from Dylan would say Dylan was like an urban poet, although Dylan
What do you think
was
he'd
quite
think of
keen.
that, though? I'm not so sure.
I don't know.
I don't know.
But
So I
it
think
did
of
someone else
Nigel
put,
Jenkins as
yeah,
being the
well,
poet.
sure. I
You
mean,
know.
but people might. Nigel wasn't around. Vernon already had that sobriquet that he was the Gower poet.
Yeah,
you know,
but it feels a bit forced for me.
well, there's so many poems that aren't about, but you know, there were a lot of ballads and radio things that were. Gower was obviously a huge inspiration for him. You know,
Enormous.
and he lived right on the top of things and could just go swim wherever he wanted. I mean,
There's poets, so we've worked with some schools recently, and they've narrated Bishopson's Stream, and then you have Hunt's Bay, the Ballad of Hunt's Bay, Griefs of the Sea,
Sure.
you know, the Gravesend, and the Heron.
Sure.
Oh, wonderful, and you know that he, as you said before, watched that heron.
Yes.
In Three Cliffs.
Yeah.
I go to Three Cliffs to see the heron there, the little egret, the little heron, and the cloud-backed heron. Is.
No, he's.
He's in every bit of that landscape for me.
I don't know how much longer it took, but I do think I can tell you a story about this.
Yeah.
You mentioned the bank clerk. Is that the R.S. Thomas button that you've got recorded?
Yes, I think that would be a wonderful way for us to
let me tell you this story.
Actually, so the bank clerk is in that book,
Yeah, I think it's a remarkable poem. Shall I read it?
Yes.
This is R.S. Thomas's poem for Vernon called The Bank Clerk. It was not the shillings he heard, but the clinking of the waves in the gullies and rocks of Cloughdee. Turning them over to the customers at the counter, he offered them the rich change of his mind, the real coinage, the language for their dry cheques. Punctually in the evenings at Pennard, he returned to the poem's sum, wrestling with it for delight and with the sea's care that on the blank sand tots itself. Clerks, businessmen, grousers about the cost of a poet, he has balanced honourably his accounts. But what about you? Now that's a fine tribute, I think, from another great poet, although when they had a memorial for Vernon in the YMCA, my wife actually went, and she'd seen Vernon read, because she was a Swansea girl. But R.S. was there, and Gwen says she heard him say, Vernon, yes, near the top of the second division. That was R.S.
R.S. Thomas.
Well, yeah, he's another.
I know that Gwen didn't much. He visited them in the Garth. She said he came with his American wife.
But that's late on then, when Elsie had died, his first wife.
Yes.
Gwen would have loved.
Yes.
Elsie was a painter.
Yes.
And now, the R.S. Thomas Study Centre in Bangor is now called the R.S. Thomas and the Elsie Eldridge Centre, because she was such a great painter and she could write a bit. And she was totally overshadowed by her husband. And I think nowadays, particularly, these buried wives or buried sisters like Gwen John and
I was just going to say something like Gwen John.
So yeah, I think it's interesting that
the delicacy as well of Gwen John. So
sure.
by the.
But no, RS was a piece of work, I think. But yeah, if he came with his American wife, that was after Elsie died. He met this American lady, and interesting that
quite glamorous from what Gwen
she was
said.
different. And at one point, Vernon, R.S. Thomas said, I think I'm actually living in sin at one point, before they got married. But,
I think that's what Gwen wasn't sure about.
Right, and
she
they
would have standards
did,
like that.
for sure. They did, she was lively. So she decided that RS didn't have copies of his own books. He had a son who had most of his books with him, who died young. But RS didn't have copies of his own books. And I was doing a book fair in Greganock. I had some books at Greganock. And RS was reading at a conference, and I had books there. And she came over and said, have you got any of RS's books? And I had his first book, which is called Stones of the Field. And it's very rare. And I had a copy of the first edition of it that Kajik Rees published, RS's first book, small edition. But it didn't have the dust wrapper, but inside it had Lynette Roberts' name. Lynette Roberts is a Welsh poet who was married to Kajik, who Vernon knew Lynette. Modernist poet, fabulous poet. She's getting second. Patrick McGuinness is edited of poetry now. She's a great writer, Lynette. She was from South America, but she became very Welsh and lived in the middle of Wales during the war. So this wife of ours is so excited by this. I said, look, it should be £150 that book at this point, but because it hasn't got a dust wrapper, I've only marked it 100. But it has got Lynette Roberts' signature in, which I think makes up for not having the dust wrapper. So she's really excited. So she calls, Ron! So he comes down. She said, look what he's got. I'm going to buy this. It's your first book. And we haven't got a copy. And I just looked at it. He said, you can't buy that. He said, it's incomplete. And I looked at him and I said, I don't believe it's incomplete. It hasn't got the dust wrapper, he said. And I could have taken issue with him that the dust wrapper is not part of the book, really. But collectors like dust wrappers, and like a book in fine condition with the dust wrapper is the best. But what I forgave him because the dust wrapper is an Elsie painting of a map of Wales that turns into a tree. And I think he actually wanted, I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that although he was with his new wife and he wasn't great, I don't think, with Elsie, they did stay married for a long time, and he wrote a lot of poems about that you can put together. You don't think of RS as writing love poems, but there are a group of poems that he wrote for Elsie. So,
like Hardy writing for his
sure,
wife.
well, like Dylan writing for Caitlin.
Yeah.
I bought a photograph the other day of Dylan Thomas, a good photograph that he'd inscribed on the back. Pictures by Dylan Thomas with an inscription on the back by him are quite tough. But he inscribed it for a person, and he put to Brian from Dylan Thomas, and then he wrote, the rat who married the cat. Because he married Caitlin. The rat who married the cat.
Perfect. I do think, to finish on a note, that Gwen taking on Vernon's lectures with her 5 children is the most stunning legacy.
Oh no, it was a fantastic thing to do. One would like to have been there, although I've seen her speak a few times about Vernon. She's incredible, and she can read poetry. But not that she can recite half of it. She's got that kind of memory that she can just sit in front of you. And oh, you know these lines, and there's no book, and they all come out. Oh, she knows. She knows Dylan Thomas's canon inside out. You know, she's a proper scholar in her own. I mean, she did a degree. She went to Reading, I think, and got a degree in English. You know, quietly. Again, when she's still got these kids and grandkids. Then.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to go to see her when she was living in Mumbles.
That's where
above a carpet shop or a barber's.
Oh, okay. This is on the front.
Oh no, so she was in a flat in the back.
She likes that height.
Yes.
I know that.
So she was up in this flat above what was a barber's, but then had become a carpet shop. And I used to go and see her there, and she'd be talking to me about Dylan. I'd always ask her questions about Dylan Thomas and Vernon. She never told me the same stories twice.
No, I know.
They were all phenomenal. But she'd have Con's kids climbing all over there with their Superman books and all that.
I took my daughter every time when she was a toddler.
Yeah.
And I bring her in, I'd get the doll from upstairs, always,
I took my daughter to see her as well. She was absolutely indefatigable, and she still is in a remarkable way. I went to see her, before Christmas last, and she was in fantastic shape.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how she is now. But
I haven't seen one since before COVID.
right.
But I know that
I
she's
went with
settled.
Cecily. Do you know Cecily? Cecily's a Swansea woman. Her mother knew Dylan Thomas was in the little theatre. Cecily went to London. She taught the guy who wrote the big tall television guy, who wrote Queer as Folk. And Russell. So Cecily taught Russell. So Cecily's mum was big in the little theatre, big in Dylan Thomas, at the Dylan Thomas Society. When Cecily came back, she became the president of the Dylan Thomas Society. And she goes to see Gwen regularly. So I went to see Gwen with Cecily. And it was nice to sit with Gwen and Cecily, who's no spring chicken, and just to talk to her. And Gwen was fabulous, you know.
That's good to hear.
I used to, every time I went, I'd have another question. I've just written this book, and the chapter about Dylan Thomas and music. I went to see Gwen once. I said, Gwen, Dylan Thomas doesn't talk about music much, and I knew he was going to work with Stravinsky. I said, but you know, he was in New York in the 50s, and going to bars when jazz was being played. He never mentions anything about jazz or jazz musicians. And I said, what was his musical taste? And she said that he loved smutty musical songs or double entendre musical songs. Yeah, that's right. So something like George Formby, Busy Cleaning Windows, When I'm Cleaning Windows. But she said his most favourite song was a song called, the refrain is, the title is Lydia the Tattooed Lady. The refrain is, Lydia, oh Lydia, my encyclopedia. And I think that Dylan Thomas would have relished that rhyme, to rhyme Lydia. And the song features in a Marx Brothers film, I think it's A Night at the Opera, and Groucho Marx sings that song, and you can watch it on YouTube, and the lyrics are incredible, because he goes round her body, and it's like an atlas, and it's a history lesson, because she's got Napoleon here, and she's got Livingstone here, and it's a fantastic, but when, she never told me that story, I said, oh yeah, and then she sang the bloody song. She knew the chorus, you know, Lydia, oh Lydia, my encyclopedia. So I came home, looked it up on YouTube and watched Groucho Marx sing it. So I had then, with Stravinsky and that story, and then the fact that Daniel Jones was a classical musician, and Dylan played music with him in an avant-garde way, that gave me a chapter about and so when we talked earlier about Stravinsky and Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas, I found out that Dylan Thomas, Bob Dylan, when he didn't have a backing band with him, would play the Rite of Spring to his audience to warm them up, which is not exactly what they've gone to hear, is it? You know, you've gone to see they might have seen the Byrds or the band. They get to sit there listening to the Rite of Spring, and Bob Dylan also thought that the responses to the Rite of Spring, when it was first played in Paris and there were riots, and it was like when he came to England singing electrically, having an electric guitar, and someone shouts out Judas and they all walk out disgruntled. He thought that was how Stravinsky was treated. So my pal could then write a chapter on Bob Dylan and Stravinsky, and a lot of the book came about like that.
Synchronicities.
So, yeah.
So I could talk for hours, I think.
We have.
I'm going to finish it with something. So I'm going to say thank you so much, Jeff, and a line from Vernon himself.
Right.
But he says, a poet does not address a living audience. Equally, he addresses the dead and the unborn. And I think I want to leave it on that note.